But what I've done is I've tried to take as many as I can, and then basically rewritten them with the purpose of today being able to then talk about them. Okay, so let's go through them. All right, the first one. So it's from Rhapsody, and the technique is personification. So, obviously the technique there is accurate, but in the analysis, the example here, what this person has written is that the street lamps are talking. The problem with that is it's basically just telling us what personification is. So it's basically just a definition, and we don't need a definition, okay? What we need to be saying what personification actually does in this example. Because while personification is going to have a similar effect a lot of the time, every single example is going to be slightly different. But what you'll start to notice is the more that you start to do this, you will start to notice effects of techniques that are really basically common, that happen all the time. And that's going to be really useful for you guys when you get to the actual exams and you've got to do your short answer responses. You're going to have to do them under time conditions, and you're going to have to be able to analyze examples without having any reference to anything else. Okay. And so that's why I'm really pushing for you guys to do this and to do it yourselves and do the hard work so that you learn how to do this properly. All right. So in this example, if we go personification, so we know that personification is when you turn something into, give it human-like qualities. So we know that this street lamp, then it's sputtered and the street lamp muttered. So we know we've got this vision, this idea of this street lamp that's alive. And so what we then get is that I've been really succinct here, but that's because I'm trying to show you guys, keep it succinct here, you can expand on it in your essays. It establishes aspects of the environment as a character. So what this personification is doing is that it's saying the characters are not just the persona. It's not just the people walking around. What Eliot is doing is he's actually turning the street into a character, okay, that he interacts with, or that the persona interacts with. So then why does he do that? Because he wants to, so I've said, to evoke the persona's intimacy with his surroundings. He wants us to see that the persona actually has this really close personal connection with their surroundings. It's like they actually, communicate with the street lamp. Okay, it sounds crazy, but it's this idea that they feel like their surroundings are alive. So you can see that. Hopefully you can see that all of this is still inside the text. All of this is still inside the text. It's about what's happening inside the text. So then I haven't done the evaluations yet. And the reason I haven't done them is because they're going to be different depending on what concept you want to focus on. Okay. But basically the evaluation has to move beyond the text. And so it's this idea of what insight, or what is it that Eliot is trying to communicate to us. So in the one that's been provided, there's something here about emphasize the individual being in the moment. That's kind of getting close to an evaluation. It's still a little bit inside the text. The main problem is that it's not very clear. So what is it that Eliot wants to demonstrate? And when we do the evaluation, that's where we sort of need to connect it to the poem as a whole, okay? How is it that this example is telling us or helping us to understand the ideas of the poem as a whole? Or how is it, sometimes it can be just as simple as, how is it helping us to understand the ideas of this part of the poem? Because there's going to be lots of ideas in a poem. All right, now, before I go on to the next one, and what we'll do is we'll come back to evaluation. Before I go on to the next one, I want you to notice something that to me is really important. I've been really methodical in the way that I've filled this out. So in all of my analysis, I start with a verb. So I've got establishes, I've got creates, I've got implies, I've got suggests, I've got evokes. Okay, every single one, I start with a verb. And those verbs you'll find will align to the different parts of the communication pie. And the reason I'm doing that is because when you start with, say, a noun, you get sidetracked. Because really what an analysis needs to do is it needs to focus on what the technique is doing. So if it's focusing on what the technique is doing, that's a verb. I guess a really important piece of advice when you're filling out these tables, start with a verb. And if you need some simple verbs, like a simple list, go back to the pie, the visual, it's got verbs on there. matching to each of the segments. And if you're using those verbs, they're going to actually help to prompt you to be thinking in the right direction, I guess is one way to put it. Then when I get to the objective, again, I'm using the same kind of structure all the time. So you'll notice in the objective that I've always started with to, okay, because that if you were to ask someone, why are you doing that? Or if you were to answer the question why, you're going to answer with this particular language structure, which is to and then a verb. Okay. Why is the composer doing it? To evoke. Why is the composer doing it? To suggest. Why is the composer doing it? Again, to suggest. So what I'm trying to really emphasize here is if you start to be a little bit more disciplined in the way that you structure your responses, you're going to find that things are going to start to come together. You'll then see that in the evaluation, I'm always, while I haven't written out the evaluation, they're always going to start with demonstrates. Now, again, this is your plan. Okay, this is what you're going to be able to use to revise for the exams. So it doesn't mean that in the exam you have to write demonstrates every single time. But in terms of getting you into the right kind of mindset to make sure that you're evaluating, it helps if you've got like a little prompt, okay? Because if you start with that word demonstrates, you're going to focus on, well, what does it demonstrate? What insight does it show us? What does it teach us? So let's have a look at another one. So looking at this second one, from Rhapsody again, assonance. So the first problem here was that it's not actually an example of assonance if it stresses the S sound. Alliteration is the consonants, assonance is the vowels. So it's alliteration because it's the S sound, which more specifically is called sibilance. Okay, so what does that do? So in this case, it creates, I've said, a fastidious tone because it sort of evokes this idea of this person who's being very particular about the way they use language. And so it's to suggest the persona pays close attention to details. And you'll see that, these are pretty close in this example. And that's fine because, again, when you get to writing about it, you can merge those two. You don't need to always write all of that out in full when you get to your essay. But it's good to actually tease apart what is going on for your own clarity so that you know what you're talking about. Because what I'm seeing a lot is that I'll have a technique, I'll have an example, and then I'll have an analysis and an objective that just have nothing at all to do with the technique. And that when you're writing that, it completely undermines your credibility. You need to make sure that when you're analyzing, everything connects, because otherwise the reader is just going to go, this person is just making stuff up. So let's have a look at the next one. So Prufrock, biblical allusion. Okay, so the first problem with this one is the quote is too long. We want to keep our quotes short and sweet. If we can get the hang of this, I can show you how to use a longer quote and break it apart, but we really need to get right this part of it. So then the analysis here was Prufrock compares himself to John the Baptist. The comparison was made signals the self-conscious irony in comparing himself to a Christian prophet. So there's some good points in there, but it doesn't really clearly address what the biblical allusion is doing, and it really could be so much more succinct. So again, I started with a verb, implies. Okay, so it implies that the persona sees himself as a prophet of the Messiah. All right, we don't need to go through a complex explanation of who John the Baptist is, because you might have that when you unpack it more, when you write about it. You might say the biblical allusion to John the Baptist in the quote. But in terms of making sure we've got our analysis right, we need to just focus on what is it doing, okay? It's implying that the persona sees himself as a prophet of the Messiah. He's basically going, I've seen my head bright upon a platter, just like John the Baptist. He thinks that he's going to be a martyr, but that means he also sees himself as John the Baptist, who prophesies the coming of Christ, who is a really key figure in the Bible, in the Christian story. So then we go over to the objective. And I can see demonstrates that traditional influences are lost as people evolve to question, not follow in things that seem absurd. See, to me, this is more like an evaluation because it's moved beyond the text. We need to first get focus in on, well, what is the point? Why does Eliot want us to think that Prufrock thinks he's the Messiah? Because he wants us to understand that Prufrock's sense of self-important, like Prufrock thinks he's really important. Or it could be to suggest that there's the dawning of a new era. And you could use either of those depending on what you want to say in your evaluation. All right, so the next one, Prufrock, repetition. For I have known them all already, known them all. it is correct that it's repetition, but I would really like you guys to get out of the habit of using the term repetition. It's fine in the short answer section, but for these responses, you really need to demonstrate a little bit more sophistication. And so a simple way to do that is by identifying different types of repetition. Okay, so we know about anaphora, okay, but there's a whole other range of different types of repetition, and each of them do something slightly different, okay? Sometimes they do the same thing, but sometimes it helps just to be more specific so that you're not becoming repetitive, all right? So this is actually an example of epistrophe. So because it's the known them all. So it's the end. Okay. Now the analysis says Prufrock demonstrates experiences of being wise. Being a wise man who has gone through many challenges, he becomes an influential figure as he is ancient and has stories to tell. Okay. So this has nothing to do with the repetition. Okay. This is basically just a explaining or providing some kind of an interpretation. So the analysis really needs to have a clear connection to the technique. So what I've said is that it suggests the persona's preoccupation. So because the reason it does this is because when someone is preoccupied with something, they tend to repeat themselves. Okay, it's almost like he's going a little bit nuts. If we then go over to this objective, again, this one is looking more like an evaluation. And some of that could actually be used in the evaluation, okay, if it's clearly connected to your example. But if you look at my one, again, it's far more succinct, okay? It's to suggest Prufrock's obsessive nature, because we're still talking about in the text. What is it that Eliot wants us to understand about Prufrock, okay, through this example? Then we can evaluate it. Why? So that's where we would be going. So why is Eliot even showing us this character, Prufrock? What are we supposed to learn from Prufrock? That's your evaluation. We'll go through another couple and then we'll, right, so the next one's from Rhapsody again. Now, alienation is not a technique, imagery is. So it's a good example of imagery. I've seen eyes in the street trying to peer through lighted shutters. Demonstrating an image of horror. Again, this is sort of more getting towards the objective. It's not actually telling us what the technique does. So we need to think about it in terms of, if you're saying that demonstrates an image of horror, I really need to know, how does it do this? So we've got imagery. Now, there's not a big difference here between the one that this person wrote and what I've got, except for the fact that it's got a more appropriate verb and it's just a little bit more specific. So the imagery here evokes a haunting image of being watched. Why? So that's your objective. Now, this is one that I wrote, really not the clearest one, to represent some kind of darker force that preys on the individual. Okay, so we're sort of getting this sense that there's something darker also to this poem. If this were actually my one, I would be going and having a bit of a closer look there to work out what was going on. All right. Again, Rhapsody, visual imagery. It's not really visual imagery. It could be, but when I sort of think about it in the context of the rest of it, it's possibly more like symbolism, but I would probably even pay, like, I don't think I'm not too concerned about those ones. So it explores the idea that humans are desperate for a release from the monotonous cycle that they're in. My real question there would be, how does the image of rancid butter do that? When I see rancid butter, I don't automatically think of a desperate release from a monotonous cycle. So that's where you need to make that connection between what it suggests and how it suggests it. Okay, so it's basically like you've just got to make sure you add in that step that makes that connection between the technique and what the composer is trying to achieve. All right, so you've got the symbolism or the visual imagery of rancid butter. It represents the corruption of something that's otherwise wholesome, okay? Because butter is generally sort of like, it's a staple food, okay? Even though today we sort of don't think it's very healthy because it's got lots of salt and fat. At that time, it would have been considered, one of the basics for a healthy diet. And so then why? To imply, again, in the poem that there's a state of moral decay.